country of Chile, they had the same problem nearly 30 years ago. They went to an optional personal retirement account approach, and they now have individual retirement accounts for their workers. And so we must restructure programs, not just continue to trim around the edges to begin to bring it down.
How do you know how much to cut? What's the goal?
The goal is to cut deep until we are spending less than what we're bringing in. That would be the target.
That's what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah,
what do you think about a balanced budget, and do we need a constitutional amendment to balance the budget?
I believe in a balanced budget amendment, yes, because otherwise we're not going to have the discipline in Washington in terms of collectively of getting there. All you have to do is look at, the current situation in terms of what's being discussed with the super committee. Mm-hmm. The idea in Washington, D.C., for some, not you, not comes from Steve, but some people is, if you reduce the growth, that's a cut. That's not a cut.
Yeah.
That's deceiving the American people. So no, I do believe in a balanced budget amendment.
Let's talk about the Federal Reserve. The more I find out, the more worried I am about what they've been doing. We found out when we went through the legislative process for this TARP program, which I opposed, the Federal Reserve actually matched that and upped it as far as the amount of money they were sending to banks, not only in this country but around the world. They've apparently bought nearly 90% of our own debt this year, and now they're talking about another round of monetizing debt, which they call quantitative easing. I mean, what would you do with the Federal Reserve, or do you think it's a problem?
I believe we can fix the Fed, and the way we fix the Fed is we ask Congress to limit their ability, to limit their authority. One of the reasons they got into these programs like quantitative easing is because of the size of the debt, and because the debt was just spiraling out of control, and other countries were not buying it fast enough. They came up with these kinds of plans. Secondly, the Federal Reserve has, unfortunately, a dual mission: monetary stability and unemployment. That's like trying to hit two targets with one arrow. I would ask Congress to take away one of the targets, get them back to what they were commissioned to do back in 1913, and it worked well until we got into this situation relative to the debt that we have. I believe that we can fix the Fed by asking Congress to relimit their authority to do those kinds of things. Secondly, we have got to get back to sound money. Our dollar is suffering. It's similar to when we wake up in the morning, an hour is 60 minutes. We don't have to go look in the paper to see what it's worth. We've got to get back to a dollar is a dollar is a dollar.
Do you need a gold standard to do that?
Yes, we do need a gold standard to do that. We can work our way back to a standard. That's the only way we are going to make our currency the dependence, the currency that people around the world depend upon. So yes, I do support establishing standards, and there are many ways to do it in addition to a gold standard.
We've got a minute. I don't have time to ask a question, you to answer it, so I'll give you a minute for a closing remark. How about that?
This whole election, folks, is about the survival of this nation and about our liberties. And President Ronald Reagan used to remind us about this thing called freedom. Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. It must be fought for and protected. Or one day we are going to spend our sunset years telling our children and our grandchildren what the United States of America used to be like. I'm not going to have that conversation with my grandkids. And I don't think the American people want to have that conversation with their grandkids. I'm running for President of the United States because it's not about us. It's about the grandkids.
Time's up.
Thank you, Herman.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Herman Cain. Appreciate it.
He must have been in the military. Thank you.
And our next guest is former House Speaker Newt Gingrich. Speaker Gingrich. You have 3 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, first of all, let me thank all of you, and in particular Senator Mint, for arranging this and organizing it. It's great to be with all of you, and it's good to be here in South Carolina. As a Georgian, you played the right teams this last weekend for me to say congratulations. And in particular, I like the USC come from behind victory, because I identify with teams that fumble early in the game and then still come back. So, however, I do have to point out that while USC and Clemson and the Citadel did well, my daughter and my son-in-law went to Presbyterian, and they started the season once again losing. So it's a mix. In the household, it's a little bit mixed, but for South Carolina, it was great. I am really glad to be here. I think that, if I might say, that what Dr. George began in his entire approach with the Manhattan Statement and with other things that have been going on to recenter American culture is really, really important. And the fact that Senator Mint, who's obviously done a great job nationally of putting this together, Steve King, who's an increasingly important leader in the House, I think this is very important. I want to talk very briefly about American exceptionalism and then apply it very directly to one example of how big the change needs to be. Despite the fact that our current president has managed to avoid explaining on at least 4 occasions that we are endowed by our Creator, the fact is what makes American exceptionalism different is that we are the only people I know of in history to say power comes directly from God to each one of you. You are personally sovereign. So you're always a citizen, you are never a subject. Now, the Founding Fathers wrote this because they said we hold these truths to be self-evident. This is not a philosophy, it's not an ideology, it's not a theory. It's a set of truths as they understood it about the nature of being human. That we are human within a fabric created by God. And that these rights are unalienable. That means no politician, no bureaucrat, no judge can take them away from you. Now, it's important to understand this because the gap between the America the Founding Fathers created and the system currently dominating in Washington is extraordinary. We are in grave danger of decaying from citizenship to being subjects. We're in grave danger of the center of power, of sovereignty, leaving you, the people, and going to the Washington bureaucrats. If you look at the Gibson-Qatar case the other day, where 26 armed federal agents intervened in factories to discover whether or not there was illegal Indian wood. I mean, this is bizarre. This is a system run amok. And so it's important. The one example I want to give you is the courts, because I think this is a topic that is totally appropriate for us to deal with. And I think it's very important for us to get to it, and I hope in the questioning we can.
Well, just as it happens, Speaker Gingrich, I do have a question that's going to relate to the constitutional powers of the respective levels and branches of government, and the court's very central here. The question also concerns the obligations of human life. But I'll begin with a quotation that you as an historian will find very familiar. It's from President Lincoln's first inaugural address when he was facing the court's unconstitutional decision in Dred Scott versus Sanford, in which the court usurped the authority of the elected representatives of the people on the slavery issue. And Lincoln said, if the policy of the government upon vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by decisions of the Supreme Court, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers, having to that extent practically resigned their government into the hands of that eminent tribunal, unquote. Now, many argue today that we need a constitutional amendment to overturn Roe versus Wade. However, Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, as you know, expressly authorizes the Congress, by appropriate legislation, to enforce the guarantees of due process and equal protection contained in the amendment's first section. So as someone who believes, as I know you do, in the inherent and equal dignity of all members of the human family, including the child in the womb, would you, as President, propose to Congress appropriate legislation pursuant to the 14th Amendment to protect human life in all stages and conditions without waiting for a constitutional amendment?
Yes. And there's a reason for this. It goes much deeper because there are 5 or 6 other issues, such as one nation under God, such as the right to have a cross on public land. There are a number of issues where the courts have now dramatically usurped their power. Let me add to your Lincoln quote. Jefferson, being written about the question of whether or not there could be a Supreme Court, wrote back, that would be an oligarchy. Think about it. We have a document. This is the center of American exceptionalism. We are a people of law. To be a people of law, you have to have a structure. The structure of the Constitution says there's a formal way to amend the Constitution. It's a very complicated process. The idea that the Founding Fathers also meant to say, oh, and by the way, by a 5-4 vote, appointed lawyers can be the equivalent of a constitutional convention is an absurdity. All of this starts in 1958 with a Warren Court assertion of supremacy, which is profoundly wrong. The Supreme Court is supreme in the judicial branch, and the judicial branch is one of the three branches. It's the third branch mentioned in the Constitution, and in the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton says explicitly, it will be the weakest of the three branches. And so I think for the Congress to begin a systematic process, one part of which is to eliminate the right of the courts to review certain things. And to recognize we're going to have a big fight with the lawyer class. I mean, this is going to be a fight.
What you have in mind, Speaker Gingrich, the Congress's power under Article 3 to regulate the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court?
Among other things. I also would look very carefully at Jefferson in 1802 passes the Judicial Reform Act of 1802, which eliminates 18 out of 35 federal judges. Doesn't impeach anybody. It just says, this court does not meet, it will not be appropriated for, go home. Now, the judges who were going to get those jobs promptly tried to file suit, and the remaining 17 judges said to them, are you crazy? If we accept your lawsuit, Jefferson will eliminate our court. Now, I want to be clear here, I am not as bold as Thomas Jefferson. I would do no more than eliminate Judge Berry in San Antonio and the Ninth Circuit. That's the most I would go for. But let me say this, because I think this has to be part of our national debate. That's not a rhetorical comment. I believe the legislative and executive branches have an obligation to defend the Constitution against judges who are tyrannical and who seek to impose un-American values on the people of the United States.
I suspect that what's going through the minds of many of our viewers across the nation is this. Well, Speaker Gingrich is right to be concerned about judicial usurpation and overreach. That's clearly a problem. We don't want the rule of law to deteriorate into the rule of unelected lawyers. On the other hand, we need to defend judicial independence. So would your last statement be a valid warrant for concern that you're someone who doesn't respect judicial independence, the independence of the judiciary?
I respect the independence of the judiciary in judging individual cases unless the person doing the judging proves to be so extraordinarily out of the context of American life and American law that they shouldn't be there. And I think there are occasions, I mean, you can't say we have a corrective balance between the three branches, except, by the way, these two should never use it. I mean, either there's a genuine tension between the three branches and the legislative and executive have a right on occasion to correct the judiciary, or the judiciary is the dominant branch and can dictate to the rest of us. As Speaker Pelosi once said, if the Supreme Court speaks, it's the voice of God. Well, I don't agree with her.
Can I shift now to the question of marriage and another question about the Constitution related to it? We have a big debate in this in this country about the definition and meaning of marriage. It's a very important debate. There are reasonable people of goodwill on the competing sides, but it's fundamental. Should the debate in the end be resolved state by state, with each state setting its own definition of marriage, or by the Supreme Court in adjudication such as what's pending now, or by the Congress, or by a constitutional amendment setting a national standard?
I think we have to look at either, again, to the point you made, either looking at legislation involving restriction, or we have to look at a constitutional amendment. And given the current state of what's happened, I suspect you'd have to move to a constitutional amendment. But I do believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. I do believe that we have every right to defend a 3,000-year clear record that that's what marriage is. And I don't think we should be intimidated against it.
I'm out of time. Thank you.
Senator DeMint.
Dude, thanks for being here. I guess I better move this up. President Obama told us that his near $1 trillion stimulus plan, Obamacare, Dodd-Frank, mortgage bailouts, that all these programs would get our economy back on track, keep our unemployment below 8%, and obviously that hasn't happened. He's going to give another speech this week about his next jobs plan. What would be your proposal to get our economy moving and get people back to work?
Well, let me just say first that I've said pretty clearly that he's the most effective food stamp president in American history. And if you think about it, that's actually a tragedy. I mean, that means that millions of jobs have been killed